In 1670, a sickly French mathematician sat alone in a room and wrote a sentence that would take 350 years to fully come true. He wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from one single fact: we are unable to sit quietly in a room alone. He did not have smartphones. He did not have Instagram or push notifications or an algorithm trained on his eye movements. He had candles, silence, and the terrifying openness of his own mind. And he was already afraid of it. His name was Blaise Pascal, and he was describing something he called diversion. Not distraction in the modern sense, not a to-do list interrupting your focus, but something closer to a survival mechanism. He believed that human beings cannot tolerate direct contact with their own existence for very long. Left alone with nothing to do, no task, no noise, no spectacle, a person begins to feel the full weight of their condition, that they will die, that their life has no guaranteed meaning, that time is passing and they cannot stop it. Pascal thought that kings surrounded themselves with courtiers and hunts and entertainments not because they needed amusement but because stillness was unbearable. A king alone in a quiet room is just a man who is going to die like anyone else. The noise is what keeps that thought at bay. Pascal was writing about aristocrats and their hunting parties. But he could have been writing about you at 11:47 p.m., lying in bed, thumb moving across a piece of glass, watching video after video after video of things you will forget within the hour. You are not doing this because the content is good. You already suspect it isn't. You are doing it for the same reason the king went hunting. Because the alternative is lying there in the dark with your own thoughts, and that is somehow worse. This is not a coincidence. This is not a modern problem that happens to rhyme with an old one. This is the same problem, wearing a different coat. And if you trace it forward from Pascal, through a Danish philosopher who thought boredom was one of the great engines of human suffering, to a German philosopher who looked at the future and saw a kind of person he despised, a person who had traded away greatness for comfort, you end up with a description of your phone. Not a metaphor for your phone. A description of it, written by people who died before electricity was common in most homes. Before we trace that line forward, it's worth sitting for a moment in the room where it started, because the room tells you something the argument alone doesn't. Picture Pascal in the last years of his life. He is not a healthy man. He has never been a healthy man. As a child he was so frail that his father delayed his education out of fear the effort would kill him, and by his 30s he suffers from headaches so severe he can sometimes barely stand, along with digestive pain that keeps him from eating solid food without agony. He has already lived an entire other life as one of the great mathematical minds of his century, inventing an early mechanical calculator to help his father with tax work, laying groundwork for probability theory itself, corresponding with the greatest scientists of his age about the vacuum, about pressure, about the weight of air. And then, in his early 30s, something in him turns. He has what he later described as a night of fire, a religious experience so intense he sews the description of it into the lining of his coat, where it's found only after his death, and from that night forward the mathematician becomes something closer to a monk, retreating to Port Royal, a Jansenist community outside Paris, where he spends his final years in austerity, in pain, and in writing fragments, notes, arguments, all intended to eventually become a single defense of Christian faith aimed at the fashionable, skeptical, pleasure-seeking aristocrats of the French court. He never finishes the book. He dies at 39, and what's left behind is a box of scraps, unordered, some barely more than a sentence, later assembled by others into the work we call the pensées, the thoughts. And it's in this state, fragmentary and unfinished, that his idea about diversion survives, not as a tidy chapter in a tidy book, but as a wound that never got the chance to close into a scar. Pascal was writing to people who spent their lives at cards, at the hunt, at the theatre, at court. The entire architecture of aristocratic life in 17th century France was, in effect, a diversion machine built centuries before anyone had a word for behavioral design, and Pascal, sick and dying and increasingly convinced that eternity was the only stake worth playing for, looked at all of it and diagnosed something underneath the glamour. These people are not enjoying themselves so much as they are running. He even used the language of the hunt directly because it was the sport of choice for the nobility around him. He pointed out something almost cruel in its precision. If you offered a man who loves hunting the deer itself, gift-wrapped delivered to his door with no chase required, he would be disappointed. It was never about the deer. He didn't want the object of the hunt. He wanted the hunt. He wanted the diversion of pursuit, the noise of the dogs, the exertion, the companionship, anything that would occupy the hours between waking and sleeping so that he never had to sit still long enough to remember he was mortal. Pascal generalized this into something close to a law of human psychology: give people what they say they want, remove the striving, and they will not be content. They will be bored, and boredom, to Pascal, was one small step from despair, because boredom is what the mind sounds like when the diversion stops and the silence underneath gets a chance to speak. Now hold that image: the 17th century nobleman, sick of the deer he finally caught, immediately organizing the next hunt because stillness is worse than exhaustion, and set it next to a fact from an entirely different century. In 2006, a former Google design ethicist named Tristan Harris began warning publicly that technology companies were engineering products specifically to exploit gaps in human psychology, comparing app design to the mechanics of slot machines. He wasn't speaking metaphorically either. The engineers he worked alongside studied, quite directly, the same psychological principle that makes a slot machine more addictive than a vending machine. A reward that arrives unpredictably is far more compelling than a reward that arrives every time. This idea has a name in behavioral science: variable ratio reinforcement, and it comes from a mid-20th century psychologist named B.F. Skinner, who discovered, almost by accident, that pigeons pecking a lever for food pellets would peck far more obsessively and for far longer when the pellets arrived at random intervals than when they arrived predictably. A pigeon that gets a pellet every 10th peck reliably eventually stopped pecking when it's full. A pigeon that gets a pellet at random, sometimes the 3rd peck, sometimes the 40th, will peck almost without stopping, chasing a reward it cannot predict because the uncertainty itself becomes the hook. Your feed is a lever. Every pull might be nothing. Every pull might be the video that actually moves you, the message that actually matters, the piece of information that actually changes your day. You cannot know in advance which pull it will be, and that not knowing is precisely, mechanically, the thing that makes putting the phone down so much harder than putting down a book with a fixed number of pages. Pascal's nobleman needed an entire hunting party, a horse, dogs, an estate, and several hours to manufacture uncertainty and pursuit. You need your thumb and a slight flick of the wrist. The diversion Pascal described as an entire elaborate social institution has been compressed into a single, frictionless, always available gesture, tuned by people who understood the pigeon experiment far better than most of us understand our own behavior. Pascal thought this diversion wasn't a personal failing. He thought it was structural, built into the human condition itself, present in anyone wealthy enough or comfortable enough to have the free time in which the terror of stillness could surface. Poverty and labor, he noted almost bitterly, do some of this work for free. A person exhausted by the physical demands of survival rarely has the leisure to be haunted by silence. It is specifically the comfortable, the secure, the people with time on their hands who need diversion the most, because they are the ones with enough empty space in their day for the void to become audible. Which means the smartphone, arriving into the wealthiest, most leisure-rich civilization that has ever existed, wasn't dropped into neutral territory. It was dropped into exactly the psychological soil Pascal said was most fertile for this specific hunger, and it grew there instantly because the ground had been prepared for it 3.5 centuries in advance. There's an odd, almost poetic irony buried in Pascal's own biography here, because the man who diagnosed the psychology of the gamble is also the man credited with helping invent the mathematics of probability itself. Years before his religious turn, Pascal corresponded with a fellow mathematician named Pierre de Fermat over a gambling dispute. A French nobleman wanted to know how to fairly split the stakes of an interrupted dice game, and in working out the answer, Pascal and Fermat effectively founded modern probability theory. Pascal understood better than almost anyone alive in his century exactly how the mathematics of uncertain reward worked, exactly how expectation and probability combined to produce compulsion, exactly why a possible large payoff multiplied against even long odds can feel more magnetic than a guaranteed small one. He later reused that very framework, the logic of the wager, in his most famous argument, the one modern readers know simply as Pascal's wager, in which he argued that believing in God was the only rational bet available, because the potential infinite reward of being right so vastly outweighed the finite cost of being wrong. Whatever you make of the argument theologically, notice the shape of it. Pascal, a man who understood gambling mathematics at the deepest level available in his century, kept returning to the language of the wager, the stake, the uncertain payoff, because he seemed to recognize, on some level, that this was the native language of the mind he was trying to describe. He didn't think human beings were rational actors weighing costs and benefits in a vacuum. He thought they were creatures wired to chase uncertain rewards, for better or worse, and his entire theological project was, in a sense, an attempt to redirect that very same wiring toward the only wager he thought was actually worth making. It's not a coincidence that the same mind that diagnosed diversion also became fluent in the mathematics that, 3 centuries later, would let engineers calculate exactly how often a reward needs to arrive, and how randomly, to keep a thumb moving across a screen for the maximum possible number of minutes per day. And here is the detail that should sit uneasily with you a little longer than the rest. Pascal did not think the solution was to eliminate all diversion. He wasn't a killjoy demanding total austerity from everyone. What he thought was far more specific and far more demanding, that a person should, at minimum, occasionally choose to sit with the discomfort on purpose. Not permanently. Not as a lifestyle, but often enough and honestly enough that the underlying condition of the self, mortal, uncertain, finite, never gets buried so deep under diversion that it's forgotten entirely. He thought a life spent in total, uninterrupted diversion was, in a real sense, a life spent asleep, technically alive but never actually met by its owner. And he thought that the fear most people feel at the prospect of that meeting, the fear you might feel right now, imagining putting the phone in another room tonight with nothing to replace it, was not a sign of weakness. He thought it was the most honest feeling available to a human being, because it was the sound of the diversion finally failing to do its job. That's Pascal. Now Copenhagen, nearly 2 centuries later, and a very different kind of unhappiness. Søren Kierkegaard walked. This is one of the strange, specific facts historians of philosophy return to again and again, because it says something about how his mind worked. He wrote most of his mature philosophy while pacing the streets of Copenhagen, often for hours at a stretch, composing sentences in his head before returning home to write them down at a standing desk, sometimes producing entire books in a matter of weeks, in a kind of controlled, restless intensity. He was, by most contemporary accounts, a strange figure to encounter on those walks, thin, sharp-featured, famous around town less as a serious thinker and more as a wit and a gadfly, the target of a vicious satirical newspaper that mocked his appearance and his mannerism so relentlessly that he could reportedly no longer walk the streets without being jeered at by children. He never married, despite a broken engagement to a young woman named Regine Olsen that seems, from his own journals, to have haunted him for the rest of his short life. He died at 42, likely of a spinal condition, after collapsing in the street. Almost his entire body of work was produced in a single frantic decade, much of it under a rotating cast of invented pseudonyms, each one a different persona with a different voice and a different, sometimes contradictory, philosophy, so that Kierkegaard himself often refused to say which of the views expressed in his own books he actually held. One of those pseudonymous voices belonged to a work called Either/or, and it's here that Kierkegaard laid out the idea that matters most for us, a diagnosis of what he called the aesthetic stage of existence, and inside that diagnosis, something he named, almost playfully, the rotation method. Kierkegaard's aesthetic man is not a fool and not obviously miserable. In fact, he can look, from the outside, like the most enviable person in the room, witty, curious, always chasing the next interesting thing, never weighed down by obligation, moving through experiences the way a connoisseur moves through a wine list, sampling everything, committing to nothing. What defines this way of living isn't pleasure-seeking exactly. It's something more specific, a structural refusal to let any single experience, relationship, or commitment become deep enough to make a claim on him. The aesthetic man doesn't fear pain. He fears binding. The instant something threatens to become permanent, a friendship that expects loyalty, a job that expects years, a love that expects fidelity, he feels the walls close in, and some part of him starts calculating the exit. Kierkegaard thought this was, underneath its charming surface, a person perpetually fleeing the possibility of becoming a self, because a self, in his framework, is not something you're handed at birth. It's something you build slowly, through commitments that survive the loss of their initial excitement. The rotation method itself, as Kierkegaard's pseudonymous author described it, is almost a comic little essay on technique, half serious philosophy, half satirical self-help. The method works like crop rotation on a farm. You don't exhaust one field by planting the same crop in it season after season, so instead you rotate. Applied to a life, this means you don't try to fix your circumstances to make them permanently satisfying, because permanence itself is the enemy of aesthetic enjoyment. Instead, you constantly change the angle from which you view your unchanged circumstances. You don't need a new city, you need to notice something new about the old one. You don't need a new person, you need to reintroduce yourself mentally to a person you already know, as if for the first time. He describes, with an almost cruel wit, a man at a party who, bored by the conversation happening around him, entertains himself by mentally assigning nicknames and secret histories to strangers across the room, purely to manufacture novelty out of an evening that has nothing new to offer. The rotation method is, in other words, an elaborate, self-generated escape hatch from boredom that requires no actual change in your life whatsoever, only a constant, restless management of your own attention, angled and re-angled, so the staleness never quite catches up. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is, almost move for move, the psychological structure of opening a second app the instant the first one dips in interest, not because the second app offers anything the first one lacked, but because switching itself resets the clock on your boredom. It is the structure of rewatching the same 3 platforms in a loop, over and over, each one slightly different in format but functionally identical in what it's doing to your attention, because true novelty was never really the goal. Movement was the goal. Kierkegaard's bored partygoer inventing secret lives for strangers across the room, and the modern person switching from a video feed to a messaging app to a different video feed and back again in the space of 90 seconds are running the exact same program, separated by 180 years and a staggering amount of engineering. But Kierkegaard's real target wasn't the rotation method itself. He found it almost funny, in a bleak way. His real target was what he called despair, and this is where the philosophy gets considerably darker than a farming metaphor. Kierkegaard thought despair was not primarily an emotion. You don't necessarily feel despair the way you feel sadness. He thought despair was a condition of the self, specifically a mismatch between who you actually are and who you're presenting yourself as, or a refusal to become the self you're actually capable of becoming. And he thought the most dangerous form of despair, by far, was the kind that doesn't announce itself. A person weeping on the floor at least knows something is wrong. But a person moving pleasantly, busily, entertainingly through an aesthetic life, always diverted, always rotating, never still long enough to ask whether any of it means anything, that person, Kierkegaard thought, could live an entire life in despair without ever once recognizing the word as applying to them. He called this unconscious despair the most common form there is precisely because it's the most comfortable, and comfort is exceptionally good at disguising itself as contentment. He believed the only way out of the aesthetic stage was not more amusement and not less amusement, but a leap, a word that appears again and again in his work, into what he called the ethical stage, and beyond that, for Kierkegaard personally, the religious stage. The ethical stage means choosing to bind yourself to something, a vocation, a relationship, a set of obligations that don't depend on your mood on any given Tuesday. The crucial move, in Kierkegaard's account, isn't finding the right commitment through more research or more searching, the way the aesthetic man endlessly searches for the perfect next experience. The crucial move is choosing, and then letting the choice itself do the work of building a self brick by brick through the discipline of staying bound to it even after the initial thrill is gone. He thought a marriage, to take his own frequent example, wasn't made meaningful by the wedding day's intensity of feeling. It was made meaningful by the thousands of ordinary, unglamorous days afterward in which two people kept choosing each other anyway. The aesthetic man, terrified of exactly that ordinariness, will always find a reason to leave before the ordinary days start. It's worth being precise about what Kierkegaard meant by the ethical stage, because it's easy to flatten it into simple advice about settling down, and that's not quite what he was after. The ethical stage, for Kierkegaard, isn't primarily about following rules or being a good citizen in some conventional sense. It's about accepting that you are a continuous self across time, responsible for your past choices and your future ones, rather than a series of disconnected present moments, each chasing its own isolated pleasure. The aesthetic man, in Kierkegaard's account, effectively lives as a sequence of unrelated nows, each one optimized for its own enjoyment, with no binding thread connecting yesterday's self to today's to tomorrow's. The ethical man accepts the thread. He says, in effect, I am the same person who made that promise last year, and I am still accountable to it today, even though today I don't feel like it. That accountability, Kierkegaard thought, is precisely what the aesthetic life is organized to avoid, because accountability to the past and future is exactly what limits your freedom to simply follow whatever feels most interesting in this particular instant. And beyond the ethical stage, Kierkegaard placed a third, the religious stage, which for him involved a further leap beyond even ethical duty into a direct individual relationship with the infinite, famously illustrated through his extended, unsettling meditation on Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, a story Kierkegaard returns to obsessively because it represents a case where ethical duty itself is suspended by something higher and more terrifying, a call that can't be justified to anyone else, that isolates the person, making it in complete, solitary responsibility. You don't need to follow Kierkegaard all the way into that final religious leap to take something useful from the structure of his argument. What matters for our purposes is the general shape. Each stage requires giving up some of the aesthetic man's cherished freedom, his ability to exit anytime, his refusal to be bound by yesterday's commitments, in exchange for something Kierkegaard thought was worth infinitely more than that freedom, an actual, continuous, accountable self, capable of being disappointed, capable of failing, capable of being changed by its failures rather than simply switching to a new field before the failure has time to teach it anything. It's worth pausing on the strange biographical irony here, because Kierkegaard knew it about himself and wrote about it obliquely for the rest of his life. He broke off his own engagement to Regine Olsen, by his own later account, partly out of a conviction that his melancholy temperament and his sense of religious vocation made him unfit for ordinary domestic life. He chose, in other words, something closer to his own aesthetic exit, dressed in the language of higher purpose, and spent years afterward second-guessing whether he had made a leap towards something higher or simply run from the one commitment that might have most tested him. He wrote entire books under different names, arguing both sides of his own decision. This is not a minor detail. It means the philosopher who diagnosed the aesthetic life's fear of binding wrote his diagnosis in parts as a wound he was still examining in himself, which is perhaps why the diagnosis lands with such precision. He wasn't lecturing from a place of resolved contentment. He was describing, from the inside, exactly how convincing the aesthetic escape can feel while you're making it. Now Germany, a generation later, and a different flavor of intensity entirely. By the time Friedrich Nietzsche wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra in the early 1880s, he was, in almost every practical sense, alone. He had resigned his professorship at Basel years earlier due to worsening health, crushing migraines, near blindness in one eye, digestive collapse, and had become an itinerant, moving from boarding house to boarding house across Switzerland, France, and Italy, chasing climates that might ease his symptoms, writing in brief, painful bursts, often producing only a page or two on his better days. He had almost no close companionship left by this point in his life. A brief, complicated attachment to a young intellectual named Lou Salome had ended badly and left him, by his own letters, devastated. He was reading almost nothing but his own thoughts, walking for hours through the mountains above the Swiss village of Sils Maria, and it was on one of those walks, beside a particular pyramid-shaped boulder near a lake, that he later claimed the idea of eternal recurrence struck him with the force of a religious revelation, the same phrase, almost, that Pascal had used 2 centuries earlier for his Night of Fire, though the two men would have found each other's conclusions almost unrecognizable. Zarathustra, the character Nietzsche built to carry his philosophy, descends from a decade of solitude in the mountains to bring people a message about human greatness, the possibility that humanity is not a finished, settled thing but something that can be overcome, exceeded, built upward into something higher, what Nietzsche calls the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman, though both translations lose some of the German sense of a continual process of self-overcoming rather than a fixed superior type. Zarathustra comes down expecting, perhaps, resistance, argument, even hostility. What he does not expect is what actually happens. The crowd in the marketplace has no interest in greatness at all. They interrupt him and ask instead to hear about something else, a figure Zarathustra had mentioned only in passing, almost as a warning of what humanity might become if it fails to strive upward. They want to hear about the last man. So Zarathustra describes him, and it is one of the most quietly devastating passages Nietzsche ever wrote, precisely because of how ordinary the description sounds. The last man is the end product of a civilization that has fully succeeded at making life comfortable, safe, and free of unnecessary suffering, and has, in that very success, lost the capacity for anything higher. The last man does not want to overcome himself. He has made peace with being small, and calls that peace happiness. He works but only enough to be diverted by the work, never enough to exhaust himself, because exhaustion might lead somewhere uncomfortable. He avoids poverty and he avoids wealth in equal measure, because both are burdensome. He wants only ease. He has a little poison for a pleasant dream at night and a little poison in the morning to wake up cheerful, Zarathustra says, describing a life managed entirely around the modulation of mood rather than the pursuit of meaning. He no longer understands how anyone could love or create or long for a star, because longing itself has come to seem like an unnecessary risk. And crucially, this is the detail that should stop you cold: the last man is not miserable. He blinks. He believes he has invented happiness. He looks at his own smallness and mistakes it, sincerely, for having arrived somewhere. Nietzsche has Zarathustra delivered this description as a warning, the darkest possible outcome he can imagine for the human future, a cautionary tale meant to horrify the crowd into wanting something greater for themselves. And the crowd's response is the joke that turns the whole passage bitter. They cheer. They shout for Zarathustra to make them into last men, right there in the marketplace, because the last man's life sounds to them not like a warning but like a promise. Comfort without struggle, contentment without risk. Nietzsche's prophet came down from a decade of mountain solitude to offer people the hardest, most demanding vision of human potential he could construct, and the people, hearing it, asked to be made smaller instead because smaller was so much easier to bear. It is worth being precise about what Nietzsche was and wasn't diagnosing here, because the passage gets misused if you flatten it. He wasn't condemning comfort itself as evil, and he wasn't romanticizing suffering for its own sake. Elsewhere in his work he's explicit that mindless suffering, suffering with no direction, is simply waste. What he was condemning was a specific psychological orientation, the substitution of ease for meaning, the mistaking of the absence of struggle for the presence of a life well lived, the quiet, contented shrinking of one's own possibilities down to whatever requires the least risk. He thought a civilization that optimized entirely for the elimination of discomfort would, almost mechanically, produce citizens who no longer had the appetite or even the capacity to want anything larger than their next small, safe pleasure. Not because they were forced into it, because, given the option, comfort is what most people will choose over and over in increasingly small increments until the increments are all that's left. Now put the device in the last man's hand. He does not need to leave his room to feel he has traveled somewhere. He does not need to build anything to feel he has accomplished something. A streak, a badge, a number ticking upward will do. He does not need to risk rejection to feel a small hit of connection. A notification will simulate it closely enough. He has, in the space of a single scrolling session, access to more of Zarathustra's little poison for a pleasant dream than any 19th century reader could have imagined possible. Hundreds of tiny, harmless, repeatable stimulations, each one costing nothing, each one requiring no commitment, no risk of failure, no possibility of the kind of overcoming Nietzsche actually wanted for human beings. And crucially, just as Nietzsche predicted, the person doing this rarely experiences it as decline. It doesn't feel like giving up on greatness. It feels, most nights, like relaxing, like deserved rest, like happiness blinked into being, exactly as Zarathustra described 140 years before the first touchscreen existed. There's a second Nietzschean idea worth bringing in here, because it offers something the Last Man passage doesn't, a kind of test you can actually run on your own life. It's the idea of eternal recurrence, the one that struck him near that boulder above Sils Maria. Nietzsche poses it as a thought experiment, almost a curse whispered by a demon into your loneliest hour. What if you had to live this exact life again and again, infinitely, in precisely the same sequence, down to every pain and every joy and every wasted hour, forever, with nothing new and nothing left out? Would that news crush you, or would it be the greatest thing you'd ever heard? The passage where Nietzsche first poses this in a book called The Gay Science is worth lingering on for its actual imagery, because the scene he builds is stranger and more intimate than the idea usually sounds when it's summarized. He asks you to imagine a demon creeping into your loneliest loneliness, not a grand public moment, but the quiet, private hour when you're most alone with yourself, and whispering that everything you have ever lived, down to the smallest detail, every joy, every thought, every sigh, will return to you again, in the same order, the same sequence, endlessly, with nothing new added and nothing subtracted, forever. Nietzsche asks, would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth at the demon who told you this, cursing him for the news? Or would there be a moment, somewhere in hearing it, where you would answer him, you are a god, and I have never heard anything more divine? He says that if this thought gained power over you, it would transform you, crushing you as you currently are, or else changing everything about how you live, because every single choice would now carry the weight of eternal repetition behind it. He calls it the heaviest weight a thought could possibly carry, and notice that he chooses the word heaviest deliberately, in direct opposition to lightness, to ease, to the very comfort the last man spends his whole life chasing. The test isn't designed to be pleasant. It's designed to be, quite literally, the heaviest possible measuring stick you could hold up against any given hour of your life. He didn't intend it primarily as a claim about physics, though he did flirt with cosmological arguments for it elsewhere. He intended it as a diagnostic tool, a way of testing, in the moment, whether the life you're living is one you'd actually want repeated or one you're merely getting through. And it's a brutally effective question to ask about a specific category of hours, the ones spent scrolling. Run the thought experiment honestly on last Tuesday night, the 90 minutes between finishing dinner and finally putting the phone down to sleep, the videos you can no longer individually remember, the feeling in your chest when you finally looked up and realized how much time had passed. Would you sign up to live that specific stretch of time again, exactly as it was, forever, on a loop? Nietzsche thought most people, asked honestly about most of their diverted hours, would recoil from the question, and he thought that recoil was itself important information, a signal about which parts of a life are actually being lived and which parts are simply being spent, the way you'd spend a coin you didn't especially want to keep. Before drawing these three together, it's worth pausing on an objection because it's the honest one, and skipping it would make this whole argument weaker rather than stronger. Every generation has had someone insisting the new technology of the moment was rotting the mind. Socrates, according to Plato's account in the Phaedrus, worried that the written word itself would destroy memory, that people who could write things down would stop bothering to remember them internally and would mistake the appearance of wisdom, the ability to look something up, for wisdom itself. In the 18th and 19th centuries, novels were widely condemned by moralists and physicians alike as dangerous for young women in particular, accused of overstimulating the nerves, encouraging fantasy over duty, even causing a diagnosable ailment some called reading mania. Comic books were blamed for juvenile delinquency in the 1950s. Television was blamed for the collapse of family conversation and attention spans in the decades after. Video games were blamed for violence, and rock music was blamed for essentially everything at some point or another. Given that track record, a reasonable person should ask whether this entire argument that Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche predicted your phone is just the latest entry in a very old genre of technological panic, and whether in 50 years someone will look back at doom-scrolling anxiety the way we now look back at fears about novels ruining young women's minds, quaint, overblown, eventually disproven by time. It's a fair challenge, and the honest answer is that it's partly right and partly missing something important. The partly right part: humans probably are prone to catastrophizing new technology, and some of that historical panic really was overblown or at least mismeasured. Literacy did not, in fact, destroy human memory in any way that made civilization worse off. Novels did not, in fact, produce the moral collapse the Victorian critics predicted. So a healthy dose of humility is appropriate here. But the part the objection misses is the specific mechanism, and this is the detail that separates a smartphone from a novel or a printing press in a way that actually matters. A book, however immersive, has a fixed length, a fixed ending, no algorithm behind it recalculating in real time what will keep your eyes on the page a few seconds longer, and crucially, no economic incentive on the other end of the object correlating directly with how many hours of your day it consumes. Gutenberg's printing press didn't have a business model that improved every time a reader lost track of time. A given social media platform's revenue is, in the most literal and unambiguous sense possible, a direct function of the amount of attention it extracts from you, measured, tested, and optimized continuously by teams of people whose job explicitly includes maximizing exactly that number. Pascal's hunting nobleman didn't have anyone in his ear calculating the ideal randomized interval at which to release the next fox. Every previous moral panic in history was about a technology that was, at most, incidentally engaging. This is the first one in history about a technology that is engineered on purpose by people who have read the psychological research to be maximally engaging, with a direct financial reward for succeeding. That difference in kind, not just in degree, is what makes the 3-century-old philosophy land less like an overreaction and more like an unusually precise advanced diagnosis of a mechanism that has since been built on purpose. There's also a fourth voice worth bringing in briefly here, not because this is really his subject in the way it belongs to Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, but because he named something adjacent to it with startling clarity, and because he wrote closer to our own century than the other three. Martin Heidegger, in his 1927 work Being and Time, described a mode of everyday existence he called Das Man, usually translated as the they, a kind of anonymous, average way of being in which a person's thoughts, opinions, and even their sense of what's worth paying attention to are quietly supplied by an ambient, faceless collective rather than genuinely chosen by the person themselves. Alongside this, Heidegger described two specific tendencies of everyday, fallen existence that he thought went hand in hand: idle talk, a mode of communication that circulates and repeats what's being said without any real grounding in the thing being talked about, opinions passed along because they are already being said rather than because anyone has actually examined them, and curiosity, which for Heidegger did not mean the noble scientific virtue we usually associate with the word, but something closer to a restless craving for the next new thing to look at purely for the sake of having seen it, with no intention of dwelling on it or understanding it once seen, a mode of being that, in his words, seeks novelty only to leap away again to another novelty. Curiosity, in Heidegger's specific sense, doesn't linger. It doesn't want to understand. It wants the next thing. It should not take much imagination to notice that Heidegger, writing in 1927, roughly 70 years after Kierkegaard and roughly 50 after Nietzsche, was describing something like the internal architecture of a social media feed with unsettling precision, a stream of idle talk, repeated and recirculated without grounding, consumed by a curiosity that has no interest in dwelling on any single piece of it, moving restlessly from post to post the way Heidegger's curious person moves restlessly from site to site, never settling, never actually coming to understand any one thing before leaping to the next. Heidegger thought this mode of existence, what he called falling or fallenness, was not some rare moral failure but the default, average, everyday way most people spend most of their lives, drifting along in the anonymous they, absorbed in idle talk and restless curiosity, right up until something shook them out of it. He thought the thing capable of shaking a person out of fallenness was a confrontation with their own mortality, what he called being toward death, which, if you're keeping track, is remarkably close to where Pascal started this entire argument 2.5 centuries earlier, in a cold room outside Paris, unable to stop thinking about the fact that he was going to die. Heidegger also gave a name to the feeling that arrives when the idle talk stops and Das Man's ambient chatter goes briefly silent, and it's a useful word to have because it names something most people experience but rarely stop to identify. He called it anxiety, though he was careful to distinguish it sharply from fear. Fear, in his account, always has an object. You're afraid of the dog, afraid of the exam, afraid of the deadline. Anxiety, by contrast, has no object at all. It's the uncomfortable, groundless, almost dizzying feeling that arrives precisely when the world of everyday distraction and idle chatter stops functioning as a shield, and you're suddenly confronted with the bare fact of your own existence with no specific thing to point to as the cause of the unease. Heidegger thought most people spend enormous, largely unconscious effort keeping this feeling at bay, filling every available gap with idle talk and restless curiosity precisely because the alternative, a few unstructured seconds in which anxiety might surface, is so much less comfortable than staying busy. If you have ever felt an inexplicable unease in the first few seconds after finally putting the phone down, a kind of formless discomfort with no obvious cause, arriving right as the idle talk goes quiet, Heidegger already had a name for it in 1927, decades before there was a screen involved at all. So there they are, 3 men, 4 if you count Heidegger's brief but startlingly precise cameo, writing in 4 centuries, in 3 languages, none of them citing each other, none of them able to imagine the device that would eventually prove them all correct at once, converging on a single structure from several different directions. Pascal says the human mind cannot bear direct contact with its own mortality and finitude, and will build diversion endlessly to avoid that contact, and the diversion will grow more elaborate as the society grows more comfortable and more leisured. Kierkegaard says a life organized entirely around diversion, around the endless rotation of attention from one stimulation to the next, produces a despair so complete that the person living it typically doesn't recognize the word as applying to them because the despair wears the costume of an entertaining life. Nietzsche says a civilization that succeeds completely at eliminating discomfort will produce not heroes but last men, people who have mistaken the absence of struggle for the presence of meaning, who blink contentedly at their own smallness, and who will, given the choice, ask to be made smaller still, because smaller is so much easier to bear than the alternative. It's tempting to imagine what would happen if you could somehow seat the 3 of them at the same table, the sick, mystical mathematician, the melancholy, restless wit, the isolated, mountain-walking prophet of self-overcoming, and hand each of them a smartphone. It's easy to guess they wouldn't agree on much. Pascal would likely see the device as a diversion machine so complete it might actually terrify him, a machine purpose-built to prevent the very confrontation with mortality he thought was the beginning of wisdom, and he'd probably reach for his own remedy first, not destroying the device but insisting on scheduled, disciplined stretches of silence undertaken specifically because they are unbearable, the way a person might force themselves to look directly at something painful precisely because looking away has become too easy. Kierkegaard, ever the ironist, might actually find something to laugh at in the design of the apps themselves, the infinite scroll as the purest, most mechanized expression of the rotation method he'd described almost as a joke a century and a half earlier, proof that his satire had been insufficiently cynical, that reality had gone further than his irony dared to go. And he would likely insist, as he always insisted, that no amount of clever essay writing about the problem would fix it. Only the leap, only the choice to bind yourself to something the algorithm cannot offer you would actually change anything. Nietzsche, characteristically, might have the least patience of the 3. He might look at the average feed, at the format itself, brief, repeatable, frictionless, endlessly available, and see it not as a neutral tool misused but as last-man technology in its purest form, a machine engineered by comfortable people, for comfortable people, whose entire design philosophy is the elimination of the very friction he thought human greatness required. He might have little interest in gentle solutions. He'd likely tell you to put the phone down not because it's unhealthy, but because it's beneath you. Push the thought experiment a little further, because the disagreement between the 3 of them is actually instructive, not just entertaining. Suppose Pascal watched Kierkegaard's ideal ethical man, someone who has made his leap, bound himself to a vocation and a marriage, shown up faithfully for years, but who has done all of that without ever once turning his mind toward eternity, without the reckoning Pascal thought was the actual point of removing the diversion in the first place. Pascal would likely say this man has solved half the problem and mistaken it for the whole problem, that a life of faithful, ordinary commitment is admirable, but that commitment to a job and a marriage doesn't answer the deeper question of what happens after either of them ends, and that a person can be undiverted from Instagram while still being thoroughly diverted, in the deepest sense Pascal meant, from ever seriously considering his own mortality. Kierkegaard, in turn, might push back on Nietzsche's Übermensch with real force, because Kierkegaard was deeply suspicious of any philosophy that made the individual answerable only to his own greatness rather than to something outside himself. He might say that Nietzsche's Overman, straining upward under his own power, using his own values as the measuring stick for his own achievement, is just the aesthetic man's restlessness wearing a heroic costume, still ultimately self-referential, still ultimately unaccountable to anything beyond his own will, and therefore still missing the leap Kierkegaard thought was indispensable. And Nietzsche would almost certainly have the least patience for Pascal of the three, dismissing the entire framework of turning toward eternity as, in his own phrase from elsewhere in his writing, a kind of life-denying move, trading the only life you actually have here, now, on this earth for the promise of some other life you can't verify, and calling that trade wisdom. None of them would resolve this argument, and it's worth sitting with the fact that they wouldn't, rather than smoothing it over for the sake of a tidier ending. But notice something underneath the argument that all three, despite everything, still share. Not one of them, even in disagreeing furiously with each other, would defend the scroll. Pascal wouldn't defend it because it prevents the reckoning with eternity he thought was essential. Kierkegaard wouldn't defend it because it's the purest possible expression of the aesthetic rotation he thought produced invisible despair. Nietzsche wouldn't defend it because it's last man technology, engineered comfort with no friction and no possibility of overcoming anything. Their destinations diverge completely. One man wants you looking toward God, one wants you binding yourself to another person and a vocation, one wants you straining upward under your own power toward something greater than your current self, but every single one of their roads starts by walking directly away from the device in your hand back into the very discomfort it was built to help you avoid. Three men who agreed on almost nothing else in the history of philosophy agreed completely on that. But underneath the disagreement in tone, all three would arrive, I think, at roughly the same practical instruction, because all three located the same enemy, not stimulation itself, but the total, uninterrupted management of your own inner life by something outside of you, engineered specifically so that you never have to feel the discomfort that might otherwise prompt you to change. Pascal wanted you to feel the discomfort so you'd turn toward eternity. Kierkegaard wanted you to feel it so you'd make the leap into commitment. Nietzsche wanted you to feel it so you'd have the raw material, the friction, the difficulty, the risk out of which anything resembling greatness has ever actually been built. Different destinations. The same insistence that the destination requires passing through the very discomfort your phone is engineered to let you skip. There's a reason this convergence matters more now than it would have mattered even 20 years ago, and it has to do with a fact about the brain that none of these three men had access to, but that modern neuroscience has made uncomfortably precise. For decades, dopamine was popularly understood as a pleasure chemical, the thing your brain releases when something feels good. Research from the 1990s onward, much of it building on work by the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz studying reward-predicting neurons in primates, complicated that picture considerably. Dopamine, it turns out, isn't primarily a pleasure signal at all. It's a prediction and anticipation signal. It fires most intensely not when you receive a reward, but when a reward is uncertain and you're waiting to find out whether it's coming, which is precisely why gambling, precisely why the slot machine, precisely why Skinner's pigeons with their random pellets produce such disproportionate compulsion compared to any activity with a predictable, guaranteed payout. The dopamine spike isn't really about the reward, it's about the not knowing. It's about the gap between the pull of the lever and the reveal of what's underneath it. This is mechanically, almost precisely what Pascal was describing when he said the nobleman didn't actually want the deer, he wanted the hunt, the uncertainty, the chase. Pascal didn't have the word dopamine. He had 3.5 centuries less neuroscience than we do. But he had, somehow, correctly identified the psychological shape of a mechanism that would later be measured, quantified, and eventually reverse-engineered by an entire industry of people building products explicitly designed to trigger it as efficiently as possible, thousands of times a day, in a device you carry in your pocket everywhere you go. The nobleman needed a horse, dogs, land, a full day, and reasonably cooperative weather to manufacture one good uncertain reward experience. You need a hardware button and about 1/5 of a second. None of this is meant to let you off the hook by making the problem purely mechanical, purely a matter of exploited brain chemistry that has nothing to do with you personally, some verdict handed down by neuroscience that you're simply a passive victim of. That would actually betray what all three philosophers were trying to say. Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche were not writing about brain chemistry. They were writing about will, about choice, about the kind of self a person becomes through what they repeatedly turn toward and what they repeatedly turn away from. The dopamine research doesn't replace the framework. It explains why the framework is harder to act on now than it has ever been in human history, why the pull toward diversion, toward rotation, toward the last man's little poison, is not simply a moral weakness you can shame yourself out of, but a mechanism that has been studied, mapped, and then built into a product with an entire industry's resources behind making it as hard to resist as possible. Knowing that doesn't excuse the behavior. It reframes the fight. You are not failing a simple test of discipline when you struggle to put the phone down. You are contesting with the same basic neurological hardware Pascal had in the 17th century, a machine engineered by people who have read far more of the relevant psychology than you have and whose salaries depend on your losing. There are two more pieces of the modern research worth knowing because they extend the philosophy in ways Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche couldn't have anticipated even in outline. The first is a phenomenon researchers sometimes call attention residue, drawn from work by the organizational psychologist Sophie Leary, who found that when people switch from one task to another, part of their cognitive attention doesn't fully make the switch. It stays behind, lingering on the unfinished task, degrading performance on whatever comes next. Applied to a scrolling session, this means the cost of Kierkegaard's rotation method isn't limited to the minutes actually spent on the phone. Every switch, video to video, app to app, feed to message and back, leaves a small residue of attention behind, which means the 20 minutes you meant to spend scrolling doesn't just cost you 20 minutes. It costs you a diminished capacity to concentrate on whatever you try to do immediately afterward, an invisible tax on the rest of your evening that never shows up in your screen time report. The second is more folkloric than clinical, but widely reported enough to be worth naming, what's sometimes called phantom vibration syndrome, the experience of feeling your phone buzz in your pocket when it hasn't, a kind of hallucinated notification your nervous system generates on its own because it has been trained through exactly the variable reward conditioning described earlier to expect the possibility of a reward at any moment. Your body, in other words, has learned to anticipate the hunt even when no hunt has been called. Pascal's nobleman had to physically saddle a horse to manufacture the feeling of pursuit. Your nervous system will now manufacture that same feeling for you, unprompted, from a pocket, using nothing but a phantom sensation your own brain invented to keep the anticipation running even in the absence of any actual stimulus. If Pascal thought diversion was something human beings had to actively go out and build, this is the detail that would likely have alarmed him most. Modern diversion has become so deeply conditioned that the body now generates it involuntarily, without the person doing anything at all. Which brings us, finally, to the part of this that isn't just diagnosis, because a diagnosis without a response is just a more articulate way of feeling bad. Start with Pascal because his instruction is the most immediately actionable, even if it's the least comfortable. He didn't think the fix was moderation exactly, and he didn't think it was total abstinence from all diversion either. He wasn't asking anyone to become a hermit. What he asked for was smaller and stranger than either of those, deliberate, repeated exposure to the very silence you're avoiding, undertaken on purpose specifically because it's unpleasant. Not silence as a wellness routine with a candle and a nap that plays ocean sounds, that's just a diversion wearing a costume of stillness. Real silence, in Pascal's sense, has to retain its teeth. It has to be the kind of quiet where the thought you've been running from for weeks actually gets the chance to catch up with you. He thought a person who could tolerate that, even for short, deliberately unmediated stretches, was in a fundamentally different relationship with their own life than a person who never once let the noise stop. Practically, This might look almost absurdly small, 10 minutes with the phone in another room and nothing to replace it. No book, no music, nothing scheduled, just the room, and you, and whatever surfaces. Pascal would tell you the discomfort you feel in that gap isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's the whole point. Kierkegaard's instruction is less about carving out silence and more about what you do with the rest of your time, the parts that aren't silent at all. His insistence on commitment over rotation suggests a very specific kind of audit. Look at the things currently occupying your attention and ask honestly which ones are asking anything of you and which ones are simply available. A relationship that requires you to show up on the days you don't feel like it is doing something for yourself that infinite scroll never will, not because the relationship is more pleasant, often it isn't in the moment, but because it's binding you to something outside your own shifting moods, and Kierkegaard thought that binding was the actual mechanism by which a self gets built brick by unglamorous brick over years. He would likely tell you that the fix for a life of rotation isn't to rotate less. It's to plant one field and refuse to abandon it the moment it stops being exciting, and to notice with some discomfort how quickly the itch arrives to go find a new one instead. And Nietzsche's instruction, characteristically, is the one that asks the most of you. He would not be interested in a modest, sustainable, balanced relationship with your phone. He would be interested in what you're capable of building instead, and he'd suggest, I think, that the real test isn't whether you can moderate your scrolling but whether you can identify one difficult, risky, uncomfortable thing you've been avoiding precisely because your phone made the avoidance so easy, and go do that thing instead badly at first with no guarantee of success. He thought the entire value of struggle was that it couldn't be simulated, couldn't be scrolled past, couldn't be delivered in a 4-second clip. A skill you're bad at and slowly, painfully improving at. A conversation you're afraid to have and finally have anyway. A piece of work you might fail at publicly. He would say the last man's whole strategy is to make sure nothing like that ever has to happen to you, and that every hour spent in frictionless diversion is an hour in which that strategy is quietly succeeding. None of these three men could see the device that would eventually prove their diagnosis correct at once. But in a strange way, that makes their agreement more convincing, not less. They weren't reacting to smartphones because smartphones didn't exist. They were describing something older and more stubborn than any specific technology, a permanent structural feature of what it is to be a mind capable of imagining its own death, its own smallness, its own eventual end, and the phone simply turned out to be the most efficient object human beings have ever built for exploiting that feature. It didn't invent the hunger. It just finally built a machine capable of feeding it every 4 seconds, forever, without ever once satisfying it, because satisfaction was never the design goal. Continuation was. So here is the actual experiment, not as a scolding, and not as a productivity hack, but as something closer to what Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche were all, in their very different voices, asking you to try. Tonight, put the phone somewhere else. Not in a drawer within reach, somewhere that requires you to get up and walk to retrieve it. Sit down with nothing scheduled and nothing playing. Let the first wave of restlessness come, because it will come, usually within a couple of minutes, an almost physical itch in the hands, a mental reaching for something to check even though you already know there's nothing new to find. Don't reach for a substitute diversion either, no book, no music, nothing to smooth over the discomfort. Just notice it. Notice how quickly your mind starts generating reasons why this particular night isn't a good test case, why you should really check one thing first, why the silence can wait until tomorrow. That reaching, that itch, that flood of reasonable sounding excuses, Pascal would tell you that's the sound of 3.5 centuries of diagnosis being confirmed in real time, in your own body, right now. Kierkegaard would tell you it's the aesthetic self, caught mid-rotation, panicking at the sudden absence of a new field to move to. Nietzsche would tell you it's the last man, startled out of his comfortable blink, suddenly aware, for just a moment, that something has been avoided. None of them thought that feeling was a malfunction. All three of them, in their very different ways, thought it might be the most honest feeling a person can have, the sound of a mind meeting itself unmediated, maybe for the first time in longer than you'd like to admit. Pascal thought that meeting was the beginning of wisdom. Kierkegaard thought it was the beginning of a self. Nietzsche thought it was the beginning of the only kind of greatness worth wanting. If 10 minutes of silence sounds too small a place to start, or too large, depending on how the last few paragraphs landed on you, there are smaller versions of the same experiment worth trying first, because the point was never to pass some heroic all-or-nothing test on the first attempt. Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche were not writing self-help programs with neatly numbered steps and turning their philosophy into a checklist, risked doing exactly the thing they were all warning against, treating the whole subject as one more piece of content to consume and move past rather than something to actually sit inside. Still, a few smaller versions are worth naming, because a diagnosis this precise deserves at least an attempt at a response. Try for 1 week leaving the phone in another room during the first 30 minutes after you wake up. Not because mornings are magic, but because the first reach of the day tends to be the most automatic, the most purely reflexive, the moment closest to what Pascal would call an unexamined flight from stillness. You are, quite literally, coming up out of unconsciousness and immediately reaching for diversion before you've had a single fully conscious thought of your own. Interrupting that one reflex, even briefly, tends to reveal how much of the rest of the day's scrolling is built on the momentum of that first, barely noticed reach. Try separately, identifying one single commitment in Kierkegaard's sense, not a New Year's resolution, not a productivity goal, but something you actually bind yourself to on the days you don't feel like it. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It can be as small as a weekly call to one person you've been letting the relationship go quiet with, made on a fixed day regardless of your mood that week. The size of the commitment matters less than its consistency, because what Kierkegaard was actually after wasn't the content of the promise but the muscle of keeping it anyway, which is precisely the muscle that infinite scroll, with its total freedom to exit at any second with no consequence, never asks you to build at all. And try, at least once, running Nietzsche's actual test rather than just reading about it. Pick one thing you've been avoiding specifically because it's difficult, because you might fail at it, because your phone has made the avoidance so frictionless you've almost stopped noticing you're avoiding anything. Go do it badly. Not perfectly, badly, on purpose, as a way of proving to yourself that the discomfort of trying and possibly failing is survivable, which is the entire discovery Nietzsche thought the last man had permanently forgotten how to make. None of these experiments will feel like much in isolation. 10 minutes of silence, 30 phone-free minutes in the morning, 1 weekly phone call. One attempt at something difficult measured against the scale of the problem these three men described: a civilization-wide, centuries-old, now technologically supercharged flight from the self. These gestures look almost embarrassingly small, but that was, in its own way, the whole point Pascal was making about the nobleman and the deer. He never claimed the fix was a bigger diversion, a better diversion, a more sophisticated diversion than hunting. He claimed the fix was smaller and stranger than any diversion at all. It was simply stopping, on purpose, often enough, and staying stopped long enough to hear what the silence actually had to say. Kierkegaard never asked for a dramatic, cinematic leap performed once and never revisited. He asked for the same unglamorous choice, repeated daily, long after its novelty had worn off, which is precisely why it was so much harder than anything the aesthetic life ever demanded. And Nietzsche never promised that self-overcoming arrives all at once in a single triumphant scene. He thought it accumulated awkwardly through repeated small refusals to take the easy, comfortable, frictionless path when a harder one was available, which means the small, unglamorous version of this experiment isn't a lesser substitute for the real philosophy. It is, as far as any of the three of them were concerned, the only form the real philosophy ever actually takes. Your phone was never the disease. It's just the newest, most efficient version of a cure that was already old and already inadequate 350 years ago, a cure that treats the symptom so completely, so pleasantly, so continuously, that it's easy to forget there was ever an underlying condition at all. And like every cure that only ever touches the symptom, it leaves the actual disease completely untouched, waiting for you patiently every single time you finally put the phone back down and the room goes quiet again. Pascal died at 39, still writing fragments he never lived to organize into the book he intended. Kierkegaard died at 42, collapsed in a Copenhagen street, having spent a decade writing under names that weren't his own about a self he wasn't sure he had ever fully become. Nietzsche's mind gave out entirely in his mid-40s, and he spent the last 11 years of his life in the care of his mother and then his sister, unable to write another word, while the books he'd produced in his brief, isolated walking decades slowly found the readers he'd always suspected wouldn't arrive until long after he was gone. None of the three of them got the long, comfortable life the last man would have chosen. None of them would have wanted it. They spent their short, difficult lives insisting, from three different directions, that comfort was never actually the thing worth optimizing for, and then they died, largely unread in their own time, leaving behind exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous, hard-won thinking that a mind can only produce when it has, at some point, put the diversion down and sat unbearably in the room alone. The room is still there. It was always there, underneath every hunt Pascal's nobleman ever organized, underneath every rotation Kierkegaard's aesthetic man ever performed, underneath every little poison the last man ever reached for at the end of his easy, comfortable day. Your phone didn't build the room. It just got extraordinarily good at making sure you never have to walk back into it. The three men who tried to tell you that, writing in candlelight and gaslight and the pale winter light of the Swiss mountains, never met each other, never read each other in most cases, and never once imagined the specific shape of the machine they were describing in advance. They didn't need to see it coming. They had already found the door it would eventually be built to keep you from walking through, and they left it deliberately standing open.